A civic movement grounded in the Constitution. Patriotism explained. Not right, not left, but straight ahead.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Patriot Party, where truth, transparency, and constitutional principles come before politics. The Patriot Party movement is focused on re-empowering we the people, restoring accountability, and putting America first through honest conversations and real solutions. America first, not America only, because we lead by example.
Today's episode is a little different. Rather than interviewing a single guest, we're bringing together two respected historians who have spent decades studying America's founding and the enduring meaning of the Declaration of Independence. Joining me today are David J. Bobb, President and CEO of the Bill of Rights Institute, and Tony Williams, Senior Fellow at the Bill of Rights Institute and historian of the American founding. As America approaches its 250th anniversary, conversations about equality, liberty, representation, citizenship, and our nation's future continue to shape public debate. The question isn't whether Americans disagree. The question is whether disagreement itself has always been part of the American experiment. Today we're going to explore what the Declaration of Independence meant at our founding, how its principles have been interpreted throughout history, and whether those same principles can still unite us today. Gentlemen, welcome to the Patriot Party.
Matt, thanks so much for having us.
Great to be with
Absolutely.
you, Matt.
Yeah, so if you are ready, we're going to dive right in.
Let's do it.
All right. David, I'd like to start with you. As America approaches its 250th anniversary, what do you believe is the biggest misconception Americans have about the Declaration of Independence?
I think the main misconception that we have is that it doesn't have any real force today. That you go see it, and it's a wonderful thing to see at the National Archives. It's one of my favorite places in Washington, D.C., in fact. It sits behind a glass encasement. It's faded, but totally relevant. And I think what we've made it is a kind of dead letter. And so in this book, what Tony and I argue is that the Declaration has really been the soul of our country. And it should be, even today, 250 years on, the touchstone for our arguments. It's not just a complaint or a series of complaints against the Crown that was good 250 years ago. It's an animating argument about what it means to be an American today. That's what we're trying to really present in this book.
Okay. And before I say this to you, Tony, it's kind of like I was talking with a guy the other day about the originalists. I was like, no matter what you believe, you have to know where you came from to know where you're going. It doesn't matter what you believe. So Tony, do you agree, or would you add a different perspective to what David said?
I think David's right. We're mostly not divided over the book, mostly united in our approach. But I would say, I would add this, that a lot of people doubt sort of the universality of these principles. In other words, they didn't really mean them. Thomas Jefferson didn't really mean all men are created equal. And a lot of the actors in our book would disagree with that. Like, for example, the enslaved people who right away after the Declaration was adopted said, you know what, I've heard of these principles, I've heard of this Declaration, especially in the North in Massachusetts. They launched freedom suits, they launched freedom petitions, they won their freedom, and they said these principles apply to me, these natural rights principles. The women who met at the Seneca Falls Convention, Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison, Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King and John Lewis at the March on Washington, they really all believed that these principles were true and that we should have an expanded understanding of applying them, making sure that we not only believe in the creed, but actually perform the deed of making them a reality for all.
Yeah, and we talk about this all the time. I'd like to get your perspective from kind of a historian's perspective, because I don't get that very often. Do you think the media plays a role in this, because they zoom in and you hear on this or that, the Constitution is a racist document, when in essence it was the first document that I know of in history that said all men are created equal on paper. And they say, well, the 3/5 clause. Well, as far as I know, that was actually, they wanted 5/5. That was actually a power play, a long power play to get more power than the slave states. They didn't want to give the slave states. So do you think it's because they zoom in and don't give the full narrative? Do you think the media plays a role in this?
Yeah, I think it's sometimes, much like has happened in the past, there's been sort of a search for hidden intentions and what Thomas Jefferson really meant when all men are created equal, or how to interpret the Constitution and so forth. But David and I examined both documents extensively and divided over the Declaration, and we come to the conclusion that, looking at the plain words of the document, we would agree with Frederick Douglass, who said about the Declaration of Independence that it had saving principles. He also said he called the Constitution a glorious liberty document, even though he had been an enslaved person. And so we think Douglass has a pretty good understanding of the intent of the founders. Now, that doesn't mean that it was a reality for all immediately. We hardly argue that. It wasn't. But it was call it in Douglass's words again, the North Star by which we measured ourselves, saw that we were falling short, and individuals, groups said, we want those rights too. We want that equality. We want to participate in self-government. And they made those claims, and by and large, they've unfolded and expanded. They've been additive over the course of American history.
I love it. So I have a question for you now. I'm going to start with you, Tony. Your work has focused extensively on the American founding. Looking at today's political climate, what part of the Declaration do you think Americans overlook the most?
Well, that's a good question. I just think basically not only understanding the document, I think most of us have heard all men are created equal, and we hear about natural rights, maybe about government by consent, but actually living them is the key, right? There may be some misunderstandings about the document, but we need to do the hard work of self-government, right? We need to talk to each other more. We need to ensure that we have government by the consent of the governed, which I know is a big project of yours. We need to ensure that we are all enjoying our rights equally, right? And that we have an idea of limited government too, right? Because the people are ultimately sovereign. And these are some really good principles that maybe we just forget sometimes in the application. But as we note in the book, we've been divided over that, and we've debated all these things for 250 years. We may do so for the next 250 years. As David and I point out, that's a feature of the system, not a bug. Self-government can sometimes be a little messy, but it's rooted upon the debate, deliberation of the people and the representatives. And through that deliberation, we start to forge a consensus. We start to see our commonality as Americans and start to cross some of those divides.
I absolutely agree with you on almost everything. I don't think it's going to be this messy the next 250 years, because we're doing some amazing things with technology. Like, we can scan complex legislation and tell them what's worked, what hasn't worked, and then they can make better decisions. We're able to break down complex subjects and do clarity portals and help with affordability and transparency, so people understand complex subjects, what they're doing. It's broken down. So and one of our intelligence modules on our federal policy research coming up is going to be historical bill analysis, where it learns from all the mistakes that have been made, so it has hindsight. It has the ability to hindsight and then point it out to you. We don't want it to automate the decisions. We just want an unbiased, this is the facts, and then our people can make better decisions, citizens and politicians. But David, on what he said about the today's political climate and the part of the Declaration do you think Americans overlook the most? What's your perspective on that?
Well, I think let's break it down. There's a chapter in the book about conservatives and progressives. I think what conservatives sometimes err on is recognizing that while a hero to them, Calvin Coolidge, said at the Declaration's 150th, these principles are final, finality did not imply in and of itself that the work was finished to put them into practice. Progressives, on the other hand, tend to miss the big point that Coolidge made, which is that the statement of human equality and freedom, liberty at the time of the American founding in the document, in the Declaration of Independence, was a statement that was true then and forever. If you combine the two kind of perspectives, and I think what you get is an interesting opportunity, which is that you got to say the principles are final, but then you have to do the work. And the guy that we pointed to is the person we started the book with, Frederick Douglass. Tony quoted him earlier, the saving principles, right? When he says those things and those laudatory things about the Declaration and Constitution, he started his speech with a blistering reproach on Americans. And he basically was saying about the institution of slavery, you all have ignored this massive contradiction. And woe unto you if you continue to ignore it. And so I think the opportunity today is, and really a big debate today, you alluded to it, I think, Matt, in your question about the media, right? Take the New York Times 1619 Project. That original statement in the newspaper said that, in essence, those who declared equality and liberty for all didn't really mean it. They never meant it. And that's not the conclusion that a lot of really key leaders have come to. People who poured their life's work into putting those principles into action. And yet here we are on the conservative side of things, right? So progressives kind of doubt whether these truths were ever really true. Mm-hmm. Some conservatives right now are saying America's not a creed. America's a home. And what we argue is that America's a home, a creed, or an idea, and an argument. And so I think we see right now, kind of on the edges of progressivism and conservatism, there's a twinned kind of doubt. And that doubt is whether these truths are really worthwhile as upholding as a binding creed. We argue the answer is yes. This creed should bind us. And it's that way more than blood and soil, or even heritage, that can tie us together as Americans. You need to assent to these ideas, and these ideas are true for now and forever.
I like it. You know, and I think, you know, one of the big things, whether somebody agrees with your perspective or whether they do or they don't, I think one of the big things is we have to reintroduce civil discourse back into society, and that's one of the things we tried to do with our curriculum. We teach both sides, the living and the originalist, and we do civil debate. We're reintroducing that in society, media literacy, and for middle school they get given historical topics. Once they've been trained in debate for high school, they get given hot topics like Supreme Court rulings on abortion, whatever's going on in the news.
Yes.
And one side gets giving the living, one side gets giving the originalist, and they have to respectfully debate it. Cannot be any cussing, screaming. The teacher's the coach, and we reintroduce into society. And then they also see what resonates best with them at an early age. You know, I feel like regardless of what side you sit on, if you can have a respectful debate, and then even if you don't agree to disagree, that's okay. You know, because that is what this society was built on the backs of.
Totally agree. I commend you on that. I think it's a worthwhile thing to do, and how important that we model it for young people. You know, one of the things that young people, they're very, and always have been, not just today, but always have been, they're looking out and wondering, okay, how do I make my way in this world? And if the adults can't keep friends and have these big, kind of contentious conversations, a young person is kind of justified in saying, well, I don't want to argue and lose my friends. I'll just stop arguing. And so the problem, Matt, that we're seeing with the teachers that we support at the Bill of Rights Institute, some 95,000 strong, just at the secondary school level,
Cool.
They are very worried about the fact that kids aren't arguing at all. They're just clamming up. And so polarization can cause people to move to the edges, right, and hurl kind of these weaponized words, right, basically cussing each other out and all of the negative things that come with that. But the secondary effect is withdrawal. And when you withdraw from the argument, that's as bad.
And everybody says, well, our politicians can do better, and they can. But I say, well, we can do better too. And I don't know. Yeah, I let you guys see what the federal policy producer is, but what we're planning to do with the students, I mean, we have a 6th grade class that's using our visual aid, and they're going to use that for a competition at the end of the year. But when we scale it, what we plan on doing is for each state at the end of the year, there'll be one middle school winner, one high school winner for the best legislation. They win a scholarship, and then the legislator has the opportunity to take all or part of it to D.C., and they may go down in history for helping fix some of America's biggest issues. So can you see this? Civics instructors, parents, and students all working together as a think tank to solve some of America's biggest issues. Who better? We're the ones that live it.
Right. I mean, that very principle is right at the heart of the Declaration, right? That
Right.
creates a government based upon the consent of the governed. We've forgotten that a lot in recent decades, and yet it's something that's been debated, as we point out in the book. But it's one of the most fundamental principles of self-government, and of our democracy, of our republic. And so that is some great work. I know we are doing a lot of things at the Bill of Rights Institute, a lot of initiatives that guide students and teachers, citizens towards that very same principle and being able to act on it as well, as you pointed out.
Well,
Matt, I just add one quick thing, if I could, to your really interesting idea here, and that is federal legislation can be really useful, and there's a place for it for sure. And a lot of the interesting debate can be, should it be at the federal level, state level, or local level? One thing that we've noticed in our work, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on this as we go forward in this conversation, is when young people are challenged to think about things in their local communities, their ability to kind of, one, wrap their arms around that, it's a little easier, and secondly, if they fail to get something enacted, whether it's legislation or activity in civil society, right? Because civics isn't just about government, it's also about what we do when we work together outside of government. And so we have encouraged young people to do things at the local level and then to understand our system of federalism. When they don't boil the ocean, I'm not suggesting that you're boiling the ocean here, I'm just saying that in general, when a young person doesn't have to run right in and try to boil the ocean, they're less likely when they fail to give up on the whole democratic small d project.
I'm glad you said that, because actually one of the next intelligence layers is going to be so they can do local and state policy, but it's so much more than just the regular Constitution. Yeah. Every state's got a Constitution, so it's a big layer, and I'm not a software engineer, so I really am going to want some help before I do that layer myself. But we have a plan, we have the architecture for it.
That's awesome. You better get a team for Alabama's, because it's 300,000 words. It's a really long Constitution.
Well, hopefully AI can break it down. I just need a lawyer to read AI's breakdown of it. So, I was going to tell you, though, the two things, I didn't start out wanting to develop a curriculum or even with this movement, but there were two studies, and they touched right down on what we're talking about. One, and it came out within 1 week, because really it started as a podcast. I was reporting on Truth and Constitution every week. I didn't even have guests on. And in 1 week, I did two studies. One said more than 3 in 10 Americans believe it's going to take violence to get us back on track politically. Yeah, and the other said less than 1 in 5 Americans know the 3 branches of government. So I tested it. My wife's a nurse practitioner. We have doctor friends. Everybody knew 2. They didn't know 3. I said, this is not about minority. This isn't about skin color. This isn't about income. This is missing, and it needs to be in there.
Yeah.
Okay, let's get back to what's going on. So one of the themes of your book is that disagreement over the Declaration isn't a weakness, but part of the American tradition. Why do you think that's an important lesson for Americans today? And we can start with you, David, since we started with you last time, Tony.
Yeah, so it's vital that we understand that we are divided today, but let's think about, and this is where history really comes in so vitally. There's two periods that we've been more divided. The first and foremost is the violent rupture that was the 4-year bloody Civil War. Secondly, in the wake of, and really the era surrounding Vietnam, polarization was even at a higher level. Negative affective polarization is waking up in the morning and thinking about who you need to beat and who you hate. That is right now not at an all-time high, but it is at very high levels. That is bad, right? But what we're trying to argue, and what we really have, I think, shown in this book, is that not that we shouldn't be concerned about our division. It's really a book, spoiler alert, as much about unity as it is division. Because right now, we argue that we're less divided than it might seem when you look at public opinion polling. So here's a really fascinating thing that we learned in the course of the research for this book. If you're one of those unlikely people that picks up the phone when a pollster calls you, you feel pressure. And you want to tell the pollster, you don't want to look dumb, right? And so you kind of tell them if they're saying, are we really, really divided? Oh, absolutely. We're on the brink of a cold civil war, right? That you hear everywhere around you. But then if you put the questions in a different way and you do it in a private kind of opinion polling, what you start to see is that more Americans are willing to say, for example, we think the Declaration and Constitution should be at the heart of our civics and history curriculum. That's a 70 to 80% viewpoint among both Republicans and Democrats. But when you ask Republicans, how many Democrats do you think that the Constitution and Declaration should be at the heart of civics, they'll say roughly around 40%, right? That's a 40 percentage point misperception gap. And that research is in More in Common and Populace. I'm not saying that there's all these kumbaya moments in American politics, right? There are very real divisions and debates. But when it comes to some of the core things about the way that we understand ourselves as a people, there is more of a base and a reliance on a kind of common sense, almost naive, if you will, belief that the Declaration matters. It's not naive as in dumb. It's just saying, I don't need to have a higher degree of any kind. I don't need to have higher education to be able to embrace this thing and say, this matters to me. I want to claim these promises for myself. And like you said, this is not about color, national origin. It's about not even income. People want to be connected to one another in this country and to these principles. And the people who are conflict entrepreneurs, the people who are really stoking this, deserve our disdain.
Well, you know, and before we get to your take on Tony, and you may need me to repeat the question, but I have to say something, you know, and I saw this firsthand on the ground. Last year, I flew out to see my daughter in California. Her husband's stationed at the Air Force Base outside San Francisco. She's an artist, so she was setting up at the art festivals, and I helped her set up. Now, I'm from Louisiana, and it's a red state, and I'm thinking I've seen all this stuff on the news, so I go out there and I'm talking to them about the Patriot Party and the Constitution, and they're very receptive. They're all, man, yeah. You know, we just wish that we just don't agree on a few things, and we wish we could agree to disagree. And I'm like, really? Because that's what I'm screaming. And these are liberal people. It's really not. That's why I say I really fought the media with a lot of this stuff, because if you look back, you know, if you don't learn from history, it'll repeat itself. And if you look back at what caused the Roman Empire, the two biggest things that caused the Roman Empire, which is the longest lasting republic, like what, 5 times as long as us almost, the two things that caused it to collapse, the major two things, was political corruption and media misinformation, rumor mills, propaganda mills, everything that the media was back then. And I just feel like the media is what inserts it, and I don't know if it's by design or if it's just because that inflaming the public gets some more views and more clicks, and it's about money. I don't really know what it is. I can't speak on that. Whatever it is, though, they need to redesign it.
I'll jump in there, Matt, to just say I think there's Your experience is the experience of so many, not only within one's family, but with one's neighbors, right? I have many times in my life had deep friendships with people with whom I disagree profoundly on things. I've had neighbors that I could joke with on election day, right? We're going to probably cancel each other's votes out today. But you still can, have that proverbial conversation with them, or a beer at the block party, right? I mean, it's gotten to the point now where people will want to screen for political affiliation when it comes to dating or any kind of association. And so we're kind of clustering in these ways that are not helpful for trying to connect one to another. We're a plural people. Pluralism is a strength here. Because to me, pluralism is based not just on, we share a common geographical place. We share principles together. And when you actually go back to these core principles, right, who is against liberty and equality for all? Well, let's talk about the definition. Let's have a debate about that. And then as we hover up here philosophically, we might get quite a bit of agreement. Then there's going to be some disagreement about policy. What does that mean for tax structure? What does that mean for social policy? But because we disagree on policy, doesn't mean that at the next election we should seek to eliminate those people forever from the political sphere.
But don't you believe that's because we're starting from the people are starting from different realities? Like, you got one side that says 10 million people are coming across the border. You got another side that says nobody's coming across the border. I mean, one is an existential threat. The other, we don't have anything to talk about. If we don't start at what are actually facts, we can't have a meaningful discussion because we're on two different planes. You're seeing one thing, I'm seeing another.
Yeah, I think there's good evidence. There's in some of the research that I just cited, more in common. There's populace. That I agree with you about the factual basis, and that's really the heart of civics, is the acquisition of knowledge, right? We spend a lot of time in this book on just relating, like, what was the real story? How did the Declaration come to be? What were the subsequent debates that ensued? As Tony noted earlier in our conversation, what's the relationship between the Declaration and the Constitution? And so we do have to operate from the same plane of facts. Our young people are bombarded with, most of their news coming, 99% of their news for teenagers is coming from social media. And so we look at an important part of civics. We talked about civil discourse, but also that ability to sift and weigh and understand. And a lot of that can come from the back and forth between people. So argumentation, in other words, is a great way for us to begin to sift through the factual basis, move from opinion to knowledge, and from knowledge, if we're really good at it, to wisdom.
I like it. Unless you really want to answer that question, Tony, I was going to ask you a different question. You want to answer the same one, or are you going to kind of agree with him again?
No, well, I will say historically, it's not a surprise that we've been divided and that it produces unity. I mean, look at the debate leading up even over the question of independence. I mean, we were divided for over a year. We were in a war with Great Britain, and yet there was still a great deal of debate and contention over this question of independence. Should we leave the British Empire? This continued over the Declaration itself, where a committee produced it. The Second Continental Congress took about a quarter of it out, and they came to a consensus about the final document and then adopted it. They argued about the Constitution at the Constitutional Convention. They argued for over a year, right? And they agreed on a lot of things, right? They all wanted to augment national powers, at least to some degree. They all wanted a republic. They all wanted federalism, in other words, keep a lot of local and state power, but have it in a dynamic relationship with the national government. And they all agreed that it was in the service of protecting liberty and having limited government and ensuring equal rights. And even the Bill of Rights was debated itself in the first Congress. Many thought it wasn't really necessary. Others, including James Madison, changed their mind, and they made it a reality. And this continued throughout 250 years of debate and contention over the Declaration, over the Constitution. And so, in other words, we have that debate, we have that deliberation, we have shared ideals and principles, and out of that we try to forge a consensus through the consent of the governed and representatives about the best way to implement it, policy and law and so forth. And so that's a result, that debate then results in unity.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. As long as we're debating in the same reality, that's the one criteria. We gotta start from a level playing field. And it's also hard to debate with somebody that you literally have nothing. You got to have some kind of common ground to start with. It's very hard if they're over here, you're over here, and there's no common ground there. So I'm going to ask you this, Tony. If an American had never read the Declaration of Independence, what is the first principle they should understand before engaging in today's political debates?
Right. Well, I think they should follow the logic and the argument of the document itself, right? Because it makes certain assumptions about human nature, about the natural law, about humanity. And the first principle, it says that self-evident truth is all men are created equal. Well, what does that mean? Well, I think it means an equality in natural rights. I think it confers an equal dignity upon all of the citizens. They are equal, and they're all equal before the law, and they're all, they all have equal rights. And so that grounds the ability of the people to then form a civil government in the Declaration and in the Constitution. And so I think that equality principle is really important and often misunderstood, right? We kind of typically associate it maybe with equity today, or inequality of outcomes, or trying to make sure everyone's equal. But it really confers that equal dignity, equal rights, equality under the law, and then things like equal opportunity, or as Lincoln put it, the equality of keeping the fruits of your labor, right? Which is why he criticized slavery, as we point out in the book. So I would start there and move on to rights and self-governance, and the sovereignty of the people. And the ultimate limit on government is the people.
I hear you. Let me get what do you think, David? What would be your take on that?
I think that's a really good starting point. If you could go one level deeper with our person who you asked about, Matt, that hadn't had any familiarity at all with the Declaration. And that's most Americans today, right? Let's face it, most people haven't read the document. It only takes about 10 minutes, though, so we hope that a bunch of people, maybe even tens of millions, is that too much to think about, over the next week here, could sit down and read it. But you get a little past the preamble and the lofty stuff, which we love, and you get to these interesting grievances. And to me, they form a really interesting argument. And then there's one other piece here that I'll throw in. But briefly, the grievances amount to a kind of charge against the king. You have taken up authority that is not yours. You have trampled on the rights of the legislative branch, really, or the legislative function at the time. You have overstepped your executive authority and reached into the colonies and done things that are illegitimate. And you've done it with judges. You change the times of the courts, for example, when court's going to be in session, sort of imperiously, and that certainly it makes it difficult to carry out justice. So you have legislative, executive, and judicial. Think of that. Like sometimes when I taught this, I'd ask my students to kind of code those three things, which grievance was mainly about which branch. That leads to the Constitution, right? There's a relationship between these two documents. And it's interesting, Jefferson used two references to God, and his editors, much to his chagrin, changed quite a bit of the Declaration, not all of it, but they added two more references to God. And when you got done with the thing, you had reference to Creator, you have the laws of nature and of nature's God. So let me start. You have actually the laws of nature and of nature's God, right? So that covers your legislative branch. You have Creator, which is a kind of executive. And then you have Supreme Judge of the universe, a judicial function. I think the logic of the Declaration of Independence, to sum all of this up, is a prince became a tyrant. And there's only one being in the universe that could have all these three powers unto itself, whatever you think of God and however you come to know God. And the king isn't that entity. And so there's a big argument at work here, and if we can make that relevant for people, they start to see, you know what? Now I get it why limited government is not about constraints. It's actually about empowering people, right? You say to people, you matter so much that you shouldn't have these authorities over you trying to rule your everyday.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. I mean, as far as founding principles go, for me, the most important foundations are checks and balances and separation of powers, because none of the other ones really exist if we didn't have those to keep everything in check. Okay, so we're going to kind of go from history to today. How should the Declaration influence the way citizens participate in government in 2026 and beyond? You start, David.
We argue in the last chapter of the book that it really needs to be about three things. Use those principles, know them, right? You can't love what you don't know. So study it, make it internal to who you are so that you can deliver it to your friends, have those family conversations just like you related, and do it with a smile. Also take the virtues. The Declaration actually talks about virtues, from prudence to courage. It implies a few others that are really important. A young person, or a person of any age, needs to acquire for themselves certain virtues. That's an important part about being a citizen. Honesty, integrity. Prudence is the art of seeing the just end and getting there. What means are you going to take, right? That's a lot of what we've been talking about here with politics. And then finally, there's a skill set. To take these principles and put them into actual policy, we've talked a little bit about policy, you have to persuade. How are you going to persuade? Well, you have to be open, if you're a young person, to other people contradicting your own point of view. There's a skill set that comes in that. Deliberation, something that Tony talked about earlier. So there's really three big steps that we're talking about in the last chapter of the book that allow a person to, wherever you might be politically, wherever you might be ideologically, use the Declaration as your touchstone and be open to the fact that that argument is going to change the way you think today.
It's funny you say that, because we say everything's based on truth, transparency, and the Constitution, and the Constitution is our guiding light. And we say that's the common ground. If everybody believes in the Constitution, that's the common ground that you can start your debate on. And you guys are the same way with the Declaration. I like that.
Put the two together. We're not at odds here. I think we're in heated agreement about that.
Absolutely. Do you have anything to add to what he said about that?
Yeah, I do. Matt, you mentioned a lot of great initiatives you're doing in terms of creating legislation and, writing your representative, and there's a lot of great work to be done on the national level. David and I and the Bill of Rights Institute also propose that, we also need to focus a lot more on civil society and what's going on in your local communities, and that can be in local government, you can be serving in office, but it's just doing the hard work of self-government, which is not only talking to your neighbors, but going to the Kiwanis meeting, serving other members of the community, doing reading programs for kids and building playgrounds and that kind of thing. David said we shouldn't boil the ocean. We can start with our neighbor. We can start in our neighborhoods doing this work, meeting each other at Little League or the Scouts or so forth. So doing that work in the local communities, getting to know each other better, trying to see that we're in this together with a common purpose and a common spirit as Americans, that it's much harder to see, your neighbor or the other kid's dad as sort of a political enemy. It's much easier to sort of do that on social media, do that when looking at national politics and distant politics, but the local community is civil society is really where I think we should focus.
I love it. I love it. Like I said earlier, the politicians can do better, but we can do better too. We have to hold ourselves to the same, to a higher standard, just like we do. Maybe not the same standard, but a higher standard. So, to close, I'd like to ask each of you to answer this individually. If there is one constitutional principle or structural safeguard that Americans, regardless of political party, should all be committed to preserving over the next 250 years, what would it be and why? We'll start with you, Tony, since David started last time.
Okay. So, I think the principle of limited government has a lot to do with the Declaration and the Constitution. We empower the government to do certain things, and we wanted to. Madison was a firm believer in this, and it carries forth the ideals the Constitution does of the Declaration. So they're closely tied together, as David said. But I would say, as we recognize limited government, and we recognize that each branch of government can exercise its powers vigorously, but it also has restraints, right? And some of those restraints are constitutional, right? They're legal, constitutional, fundamental law restraints on what each branch of government can do. But there's also the virtue of self-restraint, of moderation, of recognizing that, by exercising in self-restraint, you can try to push the powers of an office beyond what the Constitution says. But I think if each branch engages in that kind of restraint, while also exercising its powers vigorously, it's kind of a paradox, that we can have a more constitutional basis for government, call it everyone sort of staying in their lane, but yet doing so with vigor.
I like it. Okay, David, what would you add to it?
I'd point to the rule of law. The thing that separates a republic from an empire is whether you actually abide by the law and mean it. And I think we have to mean it. This requires a faithfulness, right? And that's where the Declaration and Constitution really have to go hand in hand. The Declaration establishes an idea that is rooted in the laws of nature and of nature's God. That's kind of an interesting phrase. In the book, we break that down and try to understand it. And that was ported over and tied to our constitutional understanding. And what I think the framers of the Constitution were really doing is saying, we're going to codify this thing. And we're going to respond to the vision, the sort of foundational document, the Declaration, and put this supreme law of the land together. And we have to give it our devotion. So law requires people to support its structure. The document itself, we started this conversation by saying, okay, you can go see the Declaration in the National Archives. You can also see the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. They're just pieces of paper at the end of the day, though, right? The Soviet Union had a beautiful statement about all the rights the people had. North Korea's Constitution and Bill of Rights are lengthy in terms of all of the rights that the people supposedly have. And we all can see that they amount to absolutely nothing. For us to extend and to live in freedom for another 250 years, we have to, each of us, do what we can to uphold the rule of law.
Yes, we each have to do our part. Is there anything, before I wrap this up, that I left out that either one of you want to add to the audience?
Well, we just want to wish everyone a happy 250th, and we all are in this together for another 250 after this, and we just love the fact that the way people are responding to these compelling stories of history. They see the civic purpose behind our book, and I hope that it's something that people can not only learn from, but also come together around.
And I'll just thank you, Matt, for what you do and for what you've given us here an opportunity to have this conversation. When you think about the legacy of the bicentennial, a lot of local history groups sprung up, hundreds, in fact, across the country. What if we reinvented civics as a part of and as the legacy of the 250th? That's the real opportunity here to say, let's Let's do it together. Let's mean it. Let's not just go out on the kind of edges of an ideology or political parties and say we need our own version of history over here, our own version of civics. Because the only way that we're going to hang together here is if we say we're going to do the hard work of arguing with one another, deliberating, and forging a kind of common bond. And that's ultimately what civics can do. It can tie you together to these principles.
I love it. I love it. I love it. I love it. That embodies everything that we're trying to do. I love it. If you guys will just hang around the studio for a minute while I wrap this up, and then we can talk a little bit after the show. All right. David and Tony, thank you both for joining us today. I appreciate not only the work you both dedicated to understanding America's founding, but also your willingness to have a thoughtful conversation about one of the most important documents in American history. If there's one thing I hope people take away from today's discussion, it's that understanding our founding principles doesn't require everyone to reach the same conclusions, but it does require all of us to keep learning, asking questions, and engaging one another, which is what we've talked about, with respect. Thank you both for being here, and until next time, remember, truth is not partisan, it's patriotic.